Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Fandom Track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail Z. Martin, and today we're talking with the author of the Gothic tradition in Supernatural. So Melissa, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you decided to pursue this topic in relation to Supernatural.
Sure. I'm Melissa Edmundson. I teach Victorian British literature and women's writing at Clemson University. And I've been a long-standing fan of Supernatural since its beginnings. I actually started watching it, from the very beginning when I was in grad school, and continued with it, until the very end of the series. And I had, it sort of intersected with my own interests. My sort of niche area is women and ghost stories and the supernatural. So sort of, in the Victorian period, 19th century, working up into the 20th century. So that was sort of my area of interest. And, here I was, watching the show for all these years. And I don't know, it just sort of kind of dawned on me one day, a good, 10 years into the series, and maybe a few years before that. But, I started thinking, well, no one's really written anything extended about, the Gothic and Supernatural. And, it may be one of those things where it was just so there, that we kind of have to pick it out and say, what different places in the series can we see specific Gothic elements? But I said, hey, no one's ever, written about this. And I remember thinking, that was maybe, season 8 or 9. And I started thinking, oh, I better do this before the series ends. you
Good
know
thing
uh,
time.
so I was like, okay, I need to do this. But then I was thinking too, it worked out really well because at the time that I had it planned out, got the essays from the contributors, got McFarland, to their credit, they were interested right away. I got really lucky with them. And they have since that time published Death and Supernatural,
Mm-hmm.
a series of essays, and I believe one more as well, fairly recently, maybe about meta I'm not
Mm-hmm.
really sure. I'm blanking on that one. But so anyway, yeah, I approached them and they were right from the beginning, they're like, we love this idea. So it really worked out well because the book itself covers the first
Mm-hmm.
decade of the show, which is sort of really nice. So yeah, so it just sort of corresponded with my interest. And I got really lucky with, finding McFarlane, and I got really lucky finding this group of contributors that contributed some really, really great essays. And they pretty much, were able to touch upon all of those initial things that I was thinking about, by putting this book together. I wanted to talk about kind of classic tropes and how the series, touches back to, Gothic in the 18th century or 19th century, the haunted castle and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And then, working up to modern day, thinking about American Gothic. And, I think something we'll talk about today is women, women's
Mm-hmm.
issues, and women being victimized a lot. I know that's kind of a hot topic related to the show. Anxiety, things like that. So yeah, it all came together, I think very well.
Now let's kind of level set with defining Gothic as you mean the term, because I think it gets thrown around, as so many terms do, to mean so many things in just casual conversation, from people who wear a lot of eyeliner and black clothing being goth
Mhm.
to whatever people use it as. And I think if people, maybe sometimes people's first experience with that is a high school literature class where they have to read Wuthering Heights, and so they're kind of stuck on It's got to be Wuthering Heights, which didn't even have vampires, let's be real.
Yeah.
So how are you using Gothic in a more scholarly and precise way? What do you mean by the term?
I think that one of the things that I look at when I think of Gothic is, again, it's sort of a kind of a general broad term, but I think it fits. And a lot of people say Gothic is everywhere, and I stand by that. I think that's completely right. If you look closely at things that you may not think about as Gothic actually are. But I think about Gothic as kind of wrapping itself up with the issue of secrets and legacy. And I know those terms are very broad, but I think that those ideas fit really well into sort of like the different maybe eras of the Gothic. So going back to the late 1700s, which a lot of people say is sort of the birth, where we have Walpole's The Castle of Otranto in 1764, which a lot of people maybe have read. And working up into things like, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which, people talk about as a science fiction text, rightly so, but also, issues of Gothic. But it has that idea of sort of this legacy of secrets and family and, not being able to escape your past. And I think the pull of the past for me is something that I always think about in terms of Gothic. And the nature of being haunted as well. That always that idea of haunting really stands out to me when I think of Gothic. Um, Another main issue with Gothic, and it all sort of fits under that broad umbrella term of Gothic, is ghost. And that has fit perfectly into the series. We might be able to get into that a little bit later, but those issues of sort of being bound to the past and not being able to let go. And I think those are all sort of nice terms that just travels with the Gothic, from its very beginnings into the Victorian period, which I feel like Gothic might get a little bit more interior during that time, in that era. Um, but yeah, dysfunctional families and psychological issues and things like that. So when I think about the Gothic, I think about those kind of big, broad, far-reaching terms.
Now you mentioned American Gothic. How is American Gothic different from the Gothic tradition as it started in Europe?
Yeah, when we think about, European Gothic, especially, again, taking place in, Italy or Germany, the Alps, we kind of have that vision, right? Or even if we've seen like the Universal, monster movies of the 30s, kind of that atmosphere. But we have those ruined castles and the dark forests and things like that. And, that's transplanted into, and people have talked about Supernatural as sort of Midwest, even getting it, more narrow. It's Midwest Gothic. It's traveling the back roads. And, even in, the first year, the first season of the show, and I think, Eric Kripke had that idea of basing it on urban legends, right? Myths and legends, but they were so closely tied to America. And they were American, and they had, American anxieties coming out of them. So, that, and Gothic can be transferred into the home, into the domestic space, just as easily as it can be in, a ruined castle somewhere in Europe. And um, I think that that's one of the things that makes the Gothic so effective is when you put it into the home and the domestic and the place that's supposed to be safe for people. And when it's not, that becomes very disturbing. You think about, a lot of the, first 5 minutes or 10 minutes of Supernatural episodes, so often we're thrown in, right? We don't know who these people are. We don't know, maybe they have the place, right, on the screen, but we don't know a lot about these people. And we just see this trauma, right, happening in that first 5 or 10 minutes. And that's all within the home. So I think that, the places they don't, Sam and Dean don't really leave the Midwest, right, all that much. They may, get to the East Coast or the West Coast every now and then, but they're very firmly placed within the heartland, right? That Kansas, right? The middle of America. So
Well,
yes,
it's that they're
Gothic,
in
yeah.
Canada, so they're the heartland of America kind of looks
It
like
looks like Vancouver. Exactly.
now when you were saying that, it brought to mind that we tend to think of haunted castles, but the haunted mansion at Disneyland Paris is an American farmhouse, like something out of Psycho, that classic era of American farmhouse up on the hill that you just take one look at and go, oh God, I know that's haunted. If I go in there, I won't come out. And that's what the haunted mansion is for Disney Paris. So yeah, very, very American Gothic.
American.
So you've talked about how the Gothic thread runs through all the locations, and let's talk about that a little bit, because you mentioned the domestic. We see people in their homes, but Sam and Dean don't have a home except for the Impala and later the bunker. They have a series of colorfully decked out cheap motel rooms.
Mhm.
How does that play into, we usually think of Gothic with big masculine libraries and studies and, like something out of Clue, only, real. It seems like a bit of a disconnect. How does it tie together?
I think you can put the Gothic into each one of those places. I think that the car, it is a Gothic space, and I have a very good essay included in the Gothic. That's something that talks about the car as sort of this Gothic castle, this moving castle. Thomas Knowles, and he's responsible for writing that one. But there's a lot of potential there when you think about it. For me, the car, and we see this a lot, is always, well, not always, but often, is the place where, again, sort of the tension between Sam and Dean, and the secrets that they frequently keep from one another, and they often say, well, it's for your own good, right, that I'm not telling you this, it's to protect you. But a lot of times those kind of secrets are revealed, right, when they are driving different places. So we have that, that movement of the car going from one place to another, but we have this kind of consistent relationship within that moving car of the brothers. And oftentimes that's where, they do say, well, okay, so this has happened. And, I finally will tell you about it. And the other one will get upset, or, kind of be silent for a while. But they have a lot of those conversations. Or it's that grounding point at the end of an episode, often, especially in those early seasons where, they're leaning against the car, having their beer, talking. So, trying to maybe figure out, what do we do next, right? Where do we go from here with the problems that they face. But it's also, again, I get back to that idea of family and, secrets, curses, you might even want to say, and legacy, and that kind of like haunting nature of what is, expected of you. And, like with the car and the bunker, to a certain extent, yes, that is, Sam and Dean, and, Dean, we can say, right, his property, that's his baby, right? That's his car. But it's inherited, right? That idea of inheritance and inherited trauma, from the family, and the absent, mother and father that we get into a lot in the series. But, there's a lot of trauma that comes with that car. And we see that even in the one of my favorite episodes is Baby. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
at season 11, right? Maybe. Where we see it from the car's perspective, but we see, and there's some funny parts in that, but also we see how the violence sort of comes inside. We have the head in the cooler and things like that, but it's also outside, and it's around, and we see like the blood kind of at one point spatter on the window in that episode. So the car is their home, in a lot of ways, that they don't have a lot that's theirs, right? So, but they have that car. And, the bunker, that becomes their home. But again, it's like the car, it's inherited, right? You can think about it as a way inherited from the men of letters. And sort of the same thing, that's where a lot of the, kind of the trauma comes in, but how the brothers sort of decorate their rooms, right? Dean really, he just latches on to that idea and he puts his things on the walls and decorates it. And Sam, he has a lot more trouble, right? His room is sort of bare and he has a lot of trouble kind of settling down. And we can see again that trauma, of what they've inherited, from their life of the family business. But there's, secret rooms and secret doors, the door to Death's library and things like that. And all that fits really well into those kind of labyrinthine places that we see going back to the Gothic castle, that started the whole thing off.
Well, even Baby has a secret,
Mm-hmm.
level in the trunk. And Sam inherits Baby every time Dean dies, which shouldn't be as often as it is for the Winchesters, but that's a number of times over the course of the show where Sam inherits the car as well. So they kind of trade it back and forth as that inherited home.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the in a very traumatic final episode of the series, one of the things that, I mean, several things stood out, but one of the things that really stood out to me was that scene where, Sam keeps the car, right? And it's in the garage and it's covered. And it's like, again, it's like that secret, right? You try to keep it covered, you try to keep it, repressed and controlled. And he gets in the car and he sits there and you can see him just, trying to, clenching onto the steering wheel and thinking about Dean. But it's that but he's sort of forcing himself to, it's a connection, to Dean, but it's also, kind of reinviting that trauma and that loss and the sadness to come back into his life. So, yeah, and it's really interesting. And before we move on, I think the motel rooms, like you said, that's an interesting place too, because it's not home. It kind of is home for them because that's all they have, right? And whether it's John dropping them off repeatedly or, them staying in places. But another one of the episodes that really stood out to me in the last season was Drag Me Away From You. Where they go back, right? I think that's the flashback, right? I think that's the final flashback episode, and you see them being dropped off. So you have that absent father, and then they go in, and we have, what is it, the Baba Yaga, right? The witch in that episode, and Sam does his thing and reads the lore and tracks it down. But you see, even at the beginning of that episode, you see the young Sam, and he has that American College guide from like 91, and he Dean's kind of giving him grief about that, like, well, you're going to do the family business, right? You're going to continue that. Why do you don't need to go to college? And then he lays out, I think it's the gun and then the college guys, and we see that, and young Sam's just looking, these are his choices,
Mm-hmm.
and but then, that episode is so nice because we have the, monster of the week, but we also have that haunting feeling and the trauma of, the brothers and Dean seeing his younger self, right, in the hallway, and he's, having to face, always those feelings of, letting Sam down, which is like his worst fear. So yeah, I mean, I think, there's several places where those motel rooms also, that idea of legacy and trauma and the return of all that, I think just it works really well with all of those three places.
Well, and especially with the kind of motels they stay in, there's almost a sense of those rooms being liminal space because they don't belong to anybody. They have
Mm,
belonged for a time to many people. They aren't necessarily the kind of place happy people go on vacation. It's usually the people who are running from something or running from themselves,
mm,
kind of on their last legs. So there
mm,
it's those kinds of hotels already have a hauntedness to them in the clientele they attract, and as often gets pointed out, the stains. You know, they stay in the kind of hotels that people find bodies under beds, and so it's not a normal, safe, home-like environment. It's very threshold.
Yeah, that's a good point too. And again, it's, that idea of, like you said, kind of that liminal space. And it troubles that idea for the brothers that, that idea of home is always troubled, when they go, even in the first season, when they go back to Lawrence, Kansas, it's that episode, it's called Home, right? And they go back, and there's poltergeist activity, right, in the family home. And I want to say that's the first time, other than the flashbacks, that we see Mary.
I think it is.
Yeah, and she helps to save, her boys from the poltergeist. And she has that moment where she tells Sam, I'm sorry. And it's sort of this ambiguous moment, like, what exactly is she sorry for? But again, that kind of trauma, and the troubled nature of going home. And at the end of that episode, we have John, across the street at the neighbor's house, not telling his sons that he's there. So there's home and family. Yeah, for Sam and Dean, it's always so complicated, and it's just something they can't quite. It's that, but that, I think that's why the car is effective, because it's home is being together for them, right? And the car is, frequently bringing them together.
Now, what about the Gothic influence on the archetypes we see in the show, and that effect on the characters and the character arcs for Sam and Dean? Where does that play into the whole Gothic piece?
Well, I think that, we see a lot of sort of stock characters, whether it is, vampires or werewolves. I could name, more witches, go on and on and on. I could spend an hour, naming all the things. But again, I think that for me, what is so powerful is, again, it's that relationship between the two brothers. And oftentimes I think that, as entertaining as they are, right, we have the monsters of the week, and that in and of itself is Gothic. But then we also have those differing, monsters and, supernatural beings or entities or whatever you want to say. They're frequently holding a mirror up, right, to Sam and Dean, and showing them what they would say maybe ways that they have failed, right, one another. And that anxiety, which anxiety is another key word. You asked me about the Gothic. I would say that's probably another key word. So it's that idea of, yes, it represents the family business that they're in, but it frequently, it reflects on them as well. I keep going back to the final season. It might just be fresher in my mind than any other. And it's kind of dawned on me that, this is not having a season finale. I'm kind of having withdrawal because it's May, right? We're supposed to have one. We didn't have one last year, but I was thinking about the episode, and the name is escaping me, but it's the one with the brothers who are werewolves. And again, you have that really nice, again, archetypal Gothic, werewolf, right? It's been around, since the 19th century or before in historical lore. But then you have these brothers, and, the older brother's protective of the younger one. The younger one wants to get out of, their tradition, get out of the family, and that type of thing. And it reflects Sam and Dean so much. But then you have, again, across 15 seasons, I'm trying to think about specific examples, but they also figure nicely in, how they sometimes pull the brothers apart. Like, it just makes me think of someone like Benny, right? The vampire, and that friendship again, which is so interesting, right? It complicates what is a monster, right? That they're not just stock, oh, he's a vampire, he's bad. So I think a lot of times the writers they're exploring issues of monstrosity and what does it mean to be a monster through these archetypal characters. And he ends up helping, and saving Dean. But then, Sam is very skeptical, of that relationship. So, they exist in the series, and I think they have a lot of uses. And, Ghost, again, something I mentioned earlier, that idea of not being able to let go of the past and that constant pull of the past. And once again, that Gothic trauma is just something that, both Sam and Dean are constantly struggling with.
Well, and the whole idea of who is the monster is present even back in the original Frankenstein, because while people mistakenly refer to the creature as the monster in the book is really Dr. Frankenstein, who dares to tamper with life and death. And the creature is a sympathetic victim. And Sam and Dean's especially Dean's black and white thinking changes so much over the course of the series, in part because of Sam, and in part because he becomes a monster a few times himself to get to see what it's like from the other side. And that does seem to play big in the Gothic tradition. That idea of what makes a monster, who is one, where do we set the lines?
Yeah, I mean, Frankenstein's a great, and you're exactly right. And I'm guilty of that too, that, you say, Frankenstein, and like the image that pops into my head is Boris Karloff, right? That's the image from the film. And you think, no, that's not, like you said, that is the creature. And when I teach that novel, and I frequently do because it's just so wonderful and has so much in it, by the end you realize, like you said, Victor Frankenstein is the real monster, in that. And or anything like, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, sort of that, that classic idea of sort of the split self, but the monsters like within, right? We hold a mirror up to ourselves and we have to see, the bad parts. So yeah, I think that does it really, it holds up really well.
Now, you mentioned anxiety a couple of times. What does anxiety, what role does anxiety play in the Gothic tradition? How does that tap into what we see in Supernatural?
I think that one of the main things that I see, when I look at anxiety in the Gothic is that fear of losing control, which again is something we can all sort of, we can definitely, relate to that idea. When the familiar becomes somehow unfamiliar. So I think that again, it comes up in so many different ways. But that idea too of the brothers, not wanting to let one another down. But then the anxiety again of, just the family, right? And what the position that they've been put into. But I think it goes back to I just think one of the, I keep saying it, but I think one of the most powerful points of the show is just, again, looking within and seeing, the imperfections in yourself and having to face that and having to be okay, just to say that I'm doing enough. And, I think it takes the brothers, quite a long time, just thinking about the whole, 15 years to get to that point. And we can we can argue probably for hours or days whether they ever really do. I know that was kind of a big topic of discussion, especially does Dean come to terms with things at the end, does Sam. But that anxiety of not wanting to let someone else down as well. I think that's one of the reasons why the like you said, the monster, the storylines or the possession, that again, that frequently you have people being possessed all the time. So I think that's really interesting too, to look at that, like you said, once you sort of become the monster, you have more sympathy, maybe for other people and other people's struggles, whether it's, a demon or Lucifer or, even the Mark of Cain. That story arc was really interesting for Dean.
Now, I noticed that one of the chapters deals with subtext, and aside from what we learned in Supernatural the musical, that you can't spell subtext without sex, a lot of Gothic anxiety comes from repressed emotions of all kinds, repressing anger, repressing memories, repressing sexual desire, repressing all kinds of very human natural emotions that the culture said you shouldn't feel or you shouldn't express. And there does seem to be a lot of that in Supernatural, whether it's denying that you're angry, denying that you haven't forgiven somebody else or yourself. How, where does that fit in from your perspective? That repression.
I think repression is huge. Again, that could be another, we could, as we have our list of, what is trying to define the Gothic. And I think that's, you just have to do a list, of different things. And I think, repression is going to be there, every time. And it goes back to that sense of, loss of control and the fear of loss of control. But I think, again, that anger, is so important, whether again, and it ties back to issues of being haunted and problematic issues of family and inheritance, because we have Dean trying to be the good soldier, right, the good son, and follow in John's footsteps, and we have Sam wanting to try to find another way, and not wanting to be in the family business. But like you said, Dean has a lot of repressed anger he doesn't want to admit, that towards his especially his father, but also to some extent Mary. I think another really nice thing that they did with her character by bringing her back is, especially with issues of women, that she sort of was rescued from that ideal mother, right, that Dean had in his mind, that she was a real woman, who's admits, oh, I only know how to cook Winchester surprise and it's awful, and I want to be back out hunting. And then we have that anger when she leaves, and Dean, we have that great scene where you can see the hurt on his face, when she says, I need some time to myself. But again, there's that idea of anger, and even the anger that the brothers feel many times for one another, that they don't want to fully admit. So that's again, you said subtext, it's always like there, that anger is always there under the surface, and it adds a nice bit of tension.
Anger and guilt and self-doubt, self-loathing, recrimination. I mean, it's just always simmering under the surface, and sometimes one of them's deeper in it than the other. But there's healthy, and then there's Winchester healthy, and they're kind of different. And you were talking about Mary. For as much as John turned their lives upside down for vengeance, in the snippets we see from before she died, we know, and I think it was from Dark Side of the Moon, when we go back into memory, as a little boy, Dean's there consoling Mary because she and John just had a huge fight. So they didn't have a perfect marriage, but the longer she's gone, the more John's memories make it a sainted, perfect thing. And she was human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, I mean, for Dean, it's like a coping. It's that creation of the ideal is like a coping mechanism. Again, it's I sound like a broken record, but trying to reclaim that lost home. And if you never really, like you said, if you never really have that perfect home, you create one. You try to create one in your mind, to try to kind of fill that empty space, right? But that idea of that, the trauma is still, like, it's again right there under the surface, threatening to come out. But yeah, that idea of a lost home, I think that's another reason why I think ghosts are so interesting in the series, because they're always they can't let go of the past. And there's some point of trauma that ties that ghost to that place. And I think, again, those troubled issues of home, you can't go home again, that type of idea, or it's something that's, like you said, created a lot of times. And Sam it's so interesting because Dean has that vision. Sam doesn't remember, as much of, especially Mary, but he doesn't have the same feeling, so it's really interesting how, yeah, they try to reclaim something, create something that was never,
Mhm.
really there.
Now, you mentioned doomed women, and
Mm.
certainly even a cursory reading of Gothic definitely sees, whether it's Wuthering Heights or Rebecca or some of the classics, women in peril, women in jeopardy, women in that dark haunted castle with the ghosts and the monsters is always a recurring theme. Supernatural has a very checkered track record when it comes to women. A few make it through, like presumably Donna and Jody. Most don't. And maybe Eileen, we're not sure.
Mm.
Talk a little bit about how that goes with the whole Gothic tradition.
It definitely goes with the Gothic tradition, and in some, like as you said, hinted at, not so good ways, that you maybe don't want to follow the Gothic tradition as much here, but it definitely is. So you have those victimized women. Um, you have, right from the very first episode, right? The pilot, the woman in white, Constance. You have, you know, again, that woman who, was a failed mother, maybe in some ways, that needs to come to terms with that, but then is also monstrous and threatening. So it's sort of like the groundwork for a lot of those issues are kind of laid right there in that first episode. Kind of the threatening woman, who has to be dealt with and, exercised right at the end of that. But then, throughout I have, I mean, to mention some, E.J. Nielsen, in the book in Gothic tradition, wrote a really nice, and I wanted to have a chapter on women, and she talks about them being repeatedly vessels, right, and unwilling vessels, and she points to Meg Masters, right, and Josie Sands, and she talks about the very violent, you know possessions of these women's bodies, and you can do a lot with that, this idea of, non-consensual, um, issues with women's bodies, and the fact that Meg, says in the show that, she knew, like, her consciousness was still there, and she was present when the demon was, inside her body and torturing people. And then you have, again, Josie Sands, who is possessed by Abaddon, and the very violent, ways that, Sam and Dean, and particularly Dean, do away with her. And you don't have it, maybe with a character like, you know, Jimmy Novak, right? Who said, you know, and Castiel says that he prayed for that to happen, right? So that seems a little bit more consensual, whereas the women, it's not so much.
Well, and Jimmy brokers a deal again, though, with Castiel later, where Cass isn't warm and fuzzy yet, and he is going to take Claire, and Jimmy begs him to let Claire go and take him. And I think it's also interesting with the possession idea. We don't usually see our rough, tough, powerful male heroes confronted with non-consensual possession. And yet, time and time again, Sam, and then later on Dean with the Mark of Cain, and with Michael, confront being forced to be possessed and inhabited and used against their will, which, like I said, we don't usually get to see big tough action figure guys deal with those kinds of issues.
Yeah, I mean, and this is, I mean, maybe just kind of a personal point. I mean, I love Lisa Barry as Death, and Billy, and I think that character was, I mean, she was great when she came in, and she had kind of sort of big shoes to fill, but she did such a great job. But then, at the end, it's sort of like, well, her death was sort of, let's say, kind of easy, where she's just sort of nicked on the shoulder, and it's just like, again, it's something. And then, I again, I have a, Ashley Walton wrote a chapter in the book on, Charlie.
Mhm.
And again, I know that that has been a particularly kind of contentious issue, that, and there, I think she does really well in that chapter, because she talks about Charlie in terms of, a Gothic heroine, where I mean, she does directly, save the brothers, that, she chooses to die, not giving the information, and, texting or whatever she does to, Sam. But again, it's this violent, death where she's in the bathtub, right? And she's, yes, it's somewhat off screen, but also she's terrified, right? So there's, even where, Charlie is this, I love Charlie, she's this, probably, maybe one of the most developed, women characters in the series. Still, that she has that death, that, yes, she saves the brothers, and that is very heroic. But, again, it's another, add to the list of another woman, another, violent death. And, yeah, even, and this has been a point of debate too, Eileen. And I know that a lot of, there's been conversations about, you know, why was she, or there or not there, and the blurred woman in the background. But, for me, and again, in the context of the Gothic, the blurred woman in the background is sort of a kind of a running theme a little bit.
Well, one of the other things that seems to be prevalent in Gothic fiction is the whole idea of the imminence of death. And if you look at what was going on during the 1800s, you had recurrent epidemics, whether it was cholera or yellow fever or typhus, malaria, and death in childbirth. So many children never lived to be adults. You could have a minor cut before antibiotics and die of gangrene. I mean, death was so prevalent, young, and personal, because death was dealt with in the home. It was dealt with by the family. It wasn't outsourced. And in Supernatural, death is a constant. In fact, we even have it personified twice.
Mhm.
But it's always there. Can you speak to that from the Gothic perspective?
I think, again, sort of the, that's such a broad topic. But again, I tie that back to, I think one of the the things that we have under our Gothic list is loss of control and fear of loss of control. And, there's so much of that where, yes, the brothers are often, what is death, right? That they're brought back so often, that it maybe loses a little bit of its meaning. But, I don't think it does, because again, it shows the relationship. It's a way to show the relationship of those two brothers. But, again, even going back, I know, you know, even the idea of the finale, I mean, that people were definitely split over, how we see, the death of Dean, the death of Sam at the end, even someone like, Mary, and it's interesting how, a lot of those deaths, were, um, for those characters were final. So, I think in a way of having, death be not so final for so many seasons. And then we finally have, yes, the series is coming to an end. But I think that, in those deaths, it was final, and it becomes very, very personal and very poignant in a lot of those ways. But I think, I mean, it took me a while to process the finale, as I know it did for so many people. And I thought back on it, and there was, issues with, oh, sorry for the, hopefully everyone's seen, in the
Mhm.
community, I think everyone has seen the finale, so sorry about the spoiler. But Dean being impaled on a piece of rebar, it fit, because death is something truly scary, because we don't know. And sort of the normal, non-supernatural way that he died is almost worse, right, in a way, because, it's this freak accident sort of that happens to him where that, was in the position that it was. Um, and then that moment that, where Dean has to let go and Sam also has to let go. And I think throughout that happens about halfway through that episode. And we see for the next half hour, Sam in a lot of ways not being able to let go, right? He names his son, he keeps the car, all of those things. So yeah, so I think, again, that idea of death is very, I think is handled, in lots of different ways. But I think when it's that permanence, that's really when I think it really hits home for a lot of
Mhm.
people.
Well, believe it or not, we are through our time. I think we could just, I would love to just sit and talk about this forever because we barely scratched the surface. But thank you so much for being a guest. Please tell us again the name of the book and where we can find it and you online.
Sure. Well, I will. I mean, hopefully, maybe we can see it here. But yeah, I have my shameless self promotion. But it's the Gothic Tradition and Supernatural Essays on the Television Series, published by McFarlane in 2016. So you can find it. Do go to their website, McFarlane. I would recommend. They have a wonderful website, so you can definitely find it there. And yeah, I'm on Twitter, and I have a website, melissaedmundson.com. And like I said, most of my work has to do with the ghost and the supernatural and things like that. So but yeah, I do. Again, I have to say again, thank you to all my contributors in the book, because they really made it what it was.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and talking about the book. And
Thank
thanks to
you.
everybody. Thanks to everybody who's watching and listening. There'll be more supernatural and more ghosts and spooky stuff here on Continual. So we'll see you online.